I've thought about these issues for a long, long time. In fact, I was one of the people involved with creating downtown crossing as a pedestrian zone, which is ignored often. And I got a couple of thoughts. The first is retail has changed dramatically. The latest statistics are that 17% of all retail in America is Amazon, Walmart, and Costco. And I expect that number is increasing. Uh, Jordan Marsh was a very big store downtown. So was Feline's. That's history. And that's because there's fewer people spending fewer dollars. Um, it's a victim of the reduced office presence. Uh, Sometimes I come in on Fridays, it's dead. I usually come in on Mondays, it's slow. The 3 days in the middle of the week are okay. Whether it be Milk Street Cafe or somebody else, they have 3 good days and 2 really bad days. And as a result of that, fewer coffees are being purchased in the morning, fewer sandwiches at lunch. Some of those folks are going to make it, some of them are not. And I think we have to do things other than talk about it. The mayor has been way out front and putting public dollars in to get free bus rides down Columbus Avenue. Why don't we tell everybody they get the tea free on Friday and get people downtown that way? I park my car at the Post Office Square garage, a deal I worked on for Norman Leventhal. On Sundays, when I come in town to go to church, there are people there with baby carriages. Why? Because it's only $9 on Sunday, because the Post Office Square Park is a hybrid. It's not only a for-profit entity. Shouldn't we also give subsidies of some sort to other garages to get families in town to go to the aquarium, to even go to McDonald's, getting people to take advantage of the downtown area as opposed to, stay in some, suburb without sewers all weekend long. Why doesn't the city make a policy that all public employees work 5 days a week, that all public hearings are held in person? If we do that, I expect that we will have more people going to the different places, eating sandwiches, buying coffee, whatever the case might be. The bottom line is, if the commercial tax base as a piece of the levy continues to shrink, and it's shrinking, and the facts are clear as can be, then more burden will be on residents. And the delta between having a residential property in Boston and one in Needham and Natick tends to shrink a little bit, which is likely to result in more people living elsewhere. Right now, it's still a bargain to own a property in the city. And the end result is that the levy doesn't grow very much, because it grows 2.5% by statute, and then it grows because of new construction. And the new construction, most years in the last decade or so, has been on either side of $100 million additional money to spend. If we don't have that money, then the budget tightens up. The battles at the city council become more unpleasant. And the other thing is, if the city wants people to invest in the city, then people's phone calls have to be returned. When phone calls are not returned, when someone cannot get a meeting, that's when people bring their money elsewhere. And I think we have to be much more proactive in that sense. And I lived through the 70s. I was on the city council. Almost nothing got built. And the city was on its knees financially for a host of reasons as a result.
Thanks, Larry. We're also here with Justin Sorbo, who's got the boots on the ground. It's great to have a perspective of a business owner who is making a go of it and really, making really successful and found a way, to carve out a kind of niche or new niche in downtown, and maybe that doesn't necessarily depend upon what the coffee shops and restaurants are depending upon, in terms of that just consumer foot traffic. So Justin, we'll turn it over to you and introduce yourself and talk about what you're seeing downtown.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, so my name is Justin Sorbo. I'm a personal trainer by trade, and I'm a business owner and partner of a small personal training studio here in downtown Boston on Pearl Street. I've been working in the downtown area for more than a decade now. And yeah, it's changed quite a bit, but we think that there's still a way to run a profitable business downtown. It's just needs to take a bit of a different path. So I guess for me, Larry put this pretty well and much more eloquently, but we need more foot traffic downtown one way or another. It's Tuesday through Thursday, decent situation. But other than that, it's pretty flat. So from a business perspective, I think what we've done is we have embraced a hybrid approach. So we sell our product on the internet and in real life. We're about 70% in person for our personal training and 30 online. And that really, really helps having that extra 30% where we don't depend on anyone's location to have revenue. I guess that's where a good place to start for me would be.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting, and interesting that you've been able to get kind of additional online, business and revenue. And Dan, you're also obviously a business owner. You have your own law firm. It's a different type of firm, right? Because you're not also not consumer facing, but you're really involved with what's happening downtown in terms of location in downtown, but also obviously also with development and real estate and in terms of new development proposals and regulations and what's happening there. So we'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Yeah, I've been working downtown for just about 30 years. I live in the suburbs, so I have the experience of commuting in. And as you note, my law firm, we specialize in representing commercial real estate developers. Larry is affiliated or associated with our firm, I guess. So I get to see Larry when he's not in Florida on a daily basis, which is a great pleasure. And I'm also one of Justin's clients. So the cool looking space behind him really does look cool, and I highly recommend those who come into Boston. Justin's place is a reason to get out of home and don't work hybrid and come into downtown. But in terms of my concerns for downtown, I guess it's a broader concern. It's really for the entire region, which is our economic competitiveness and the extent to which housing prices and the transportation network that isn't meeting the needs of the region is driving companies to relocate, making locational decisions where companies historically want to locate where the smartest people were. And Boston, had a great 30-year run of getting companies to want to be here because of the access to top talent. But if you're a company that can pay your employees 20% less and locate in Texas or North Carolina or in Phoenix, but have that 20% lower salaries go further because housing costs are so much lower, that we're really starting to see it affecting the Commonwealth's ability to both retain existing companies as well as attract new companies. And Scott, you're certainly familiar, Larry and Justin. I wrote a book on the history of Boston, which looks at the swings back and forth of the success and failure of the city, taking steps that do not embrace keeping people in the city has been a formula in the past for the city to decline, and I don't think we can take it for granted that Boston's going to, remain a place where the top companies in the world want to continue to do business because of, particularly tied to housing costs and transportation. So until we solve those, I think that the region is looking at continued trouble, apart from some of the micro issues that downtown is facing right now.
Yeah, no, interesting observations there. It's certainly, I think, and maybe that there is a sense of taking things for granted, or that there's always going to be growth, and that the city has had so many years of growth, but that's not necessarily the case. And I've read your book; it's a great book, History of Boston, and it gets into those cycles, and it's really interesting. And you can learn. There's a lot to learn there. What?
Well,
So
Scott, I think adding on to what Dan
sure.
said, my dad had two jobs. He worked at the Boston Herald before it was sold. Then he worked at the Bank of Boston. And he was on one of those enormous floors in the belly, overlooking Federal
Pregnant
Street,
building, right?
Franklin Street.
Or yeah.
The pregnant building, so-called. Nellie's belly. They probably had 500 people working on that floor, all of whom had a metal desk, a rotary phone, a waste paper basket, and in and out on their desk. And they basically, push paper. And some of the paper meant people were paying things, and some of the paper meant people were owed things. That's history. Those jobs are not coming back. When I was on the city council, the First National Bank of Boston was the biggest employer in the city, bigger than MGH. Largest private employer in the city was the First National Bank. And you can have a bank any place. You can be in a mall in Texas. You can be in North Carolina. In fact, Bank of America is headquartered in North Carolina. And if 50 years ago, you'd gone to the city council or the Chamber of Commerce or the Vault or whoever and said, two of the biggest banks in this country are going to be headquartered in North Carolina, we would have laughed. Bunch of tobacco farmers, rednecks. But that's where they are. And obviously they have figured out that they can do most everything that they need to do in a place where it's pretty nice weather most of the time and the cost of housing is much lower. So it's all tied together.
Yes, it's much more competitive and mobile and world, first for companies and now for individuals, right? I mean, you want to cut your housing costs, well, get a remote job and move out to wherever. I mean, people have done that, and we're seeing an exodus of some of those kind of young professionals as well. One thing I was looking at, I wanted to ask everybody about, was the impact that now we're in the middle of another a pretty big tax debate. It was took a lot, made headlines last fall, the mayor's tax plan to try to deal with the impact of remote work, the decline in value of office buildings, the resulting loss of revenue, and the proposal that she's put forth and has put forth again to shift more of that burden then onto the commercial properties to kind of make up for some of that lost revenue. And I'm wondering what impact that might have. I don't know if it's for Justin, whether it has any impact in your business. Are you worried that if this goes through, your rates will go up, maybe your bill will go up?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly wouldn't be a great thing to have to pay more in taxes. I mean, so if especially considering interest rates are sort of up in the air too. So when our mortgage is refinanced, we don't know what's going on there. I think, like many retail businesses, we try to pass the cost onto the customer, but there's only so far you can go with something like that, and we don't really know where that is. It's never a great feeling to have to raise prices and not be able to take any of the profit. But yeah, I mean, I guess on the other hand, if there was some type of a direct benefit to something like the MBTA or some of the infrastructure in this area or the housing that Dan and Larry, have discussed, maybe it could be a positive in some way, but it's hard for me to connect those two things. But I'm not an expert on public policy or this kind of thing.
Sure, but you're right in
So-
the line of fire, so to speak. I mean, um, Dan, what's, I know you've been following this. I mean, do you think it's, what are you concerned about the impact, or are your clients concerned about the impact, on their buildings or their projects, or?
Well, I mean, no one wants to pay higher taxes, right? Commercial property owners generally in the leases pass the taxes on a proportional basis to their office tenants, at least. So the tax impact would be felt more by the companies that lease space. Obviously with empty buildings, that doesn't happen. But at least in lease space, the tenants are going to be paying a pro rata share of the commercial property taxes. But Justin's right. I mean, it's a more of a nuanced discussion, because it also depends on what you're using the tax revenue for, for investments, and the city needs a lot of investment in the city right now. I think including commercial property owners and being part of the solution to a tax windfall, it needed to be on the table. I think that this administration didn't necessarily handle it particularly adeptly in terms of looking only to commercial property owners, rather than having it be part of a mix of some reduced spending, as well as residential property owners taking on some of that burden. And so I think it was not handled terribly well politically by the administration, which led to sort of no deal being able to be reached, as opposed to a more holistic approach that could have been done.
A lot of life is about messaging. And I think the message to people who own commercial property was not a welcoming one. As I said in the opening remarks, if you're a developer and you want to build something in Boston and you cannot get a meeting and your phone call doesn't get returned, then you go someplace else. And I think it was a lack of knowledge, I think, on the part of some of the folks around the mayor as to what the city had been through in other hard times. And, hypothetically, you have a building that's assessed at $100 million, and now it's assessed at $90 million because that's what the market says it's worth. But your loan's coming due and it's $80 million. And either you come up with some more money or you find somebody to give you a loan at a much higher interest rate. It's going down that deep hole. And there'll be buildings like that in Boston. Couldn't tell you which ones, because I'm not privy to exactly what the terms of the loans are. But most buildings in downtown Boston have a loan of some sort. Some of them are fixed. The 10 years could be up. Some of them could be flexible. I don't see interest rates going down quickly for a host of reasons. I mean, the era of almost free money is history. We had some pretty good years of that. So I think there's a whole number of variables, and I think some of the folks who talk about these things just assume that the people who own the big buildings don't have any other options. They do. Okay. For some people, foreclosure is an option. That's not a fun option. But throughout the 70s, it happened. We had a whole bunch of residential properties in the city that were foreclosed upon. People just handed in the keys to the bank. Said, your house. Not going to happen this time around because residential values keep going up, in part because the city is full of younger, mostly single people who don't have kids, who can afford more for housing than Mr. and Mrs. McGillicuddy, with the twins and the triplets.
Yeah, it's that's one of the other things that I was thinking of in terms of and you were hitting upon it like a couple times, Larry, that what happened in the 70s, what's happening now. I mean, obviously it's a much different city. Dan, you've looked at the cycles too. What are the similarities and maybe what are the differences that maybe would in terms of what we're going through now and what the city experienced in the 70s when you had all, disinvestment and, worries about crime and it wasn't a place that everybody wanted to be. Um, so what's your sense, Dan? You've looked at this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I wouldn't make the comparison only with the 1970s. I think the period of disinvestment in Boston goes back as far as, as early as the 1920s with the collapse of our industrial economy. New England's economy had been a manufacturing and industrial one, and after World War I, those mills started relocating from the Northeast and Midwest to the American South or overseas, or closing entirely. As the city started losing population, the city started thinking about how to keep people, how to sort of compete with the suburbs. And the answer to that was to try to recreate the suburbs in the city, the sort of Garden City movement, right? Which was tearing down dense neighborhoods and replacing them with low density. The solution that came up with ended up making the problem much, much worse. And so, we invested in things like highways to move people out of the city. And so we really had sort of 70 years of cataclysmically awful urban policy, not just in Boston, but in American cities generally. And it was really only by the 1990s that really started turning around. So, the city lost 230,000 people between 1950 and 1980, and a proportional number of jobs and businesses. The urban renewal, highway building displaced thousands and thousands of businesses and people's homes as well. So that type of moving people out of the city and the collapse of the city, I don't really think we're at risk of that again. I think that two things are happening that gives me confidence in the general resiliency of cities. One is that the younger generation has really rejected the car-dependent lifestyle of the older generation. And so I think young people today don't want to live in places where they have to drive everywhere all the time. Not that people don't necessarily want a car, but they want to be closer to public transportation or be able to walk to certain amenities. And so this sort of drive to live in subdivisions further and further from the city, not that there's no demand for that, but I don't think we're going to go back to the demand that we saw, 30, 40, 50, even 60 years ago. And then the other part of that is that companies in the, going back to the 1950s and the building of suburban office parks were relocating to places that they thought were easy to access by cars from people who lived in the suburbs. And we saw this flight of companies leaving the city and relocating in the suburbs. And the Massachusetts Miracle of the 1970s and 80s, which resulted in Massachusetts having the lowest unemployment rate in the country, was built by companies in isolated suburban office parks. And those companies all had essentially one good innovative idea, most tied to the personal computer. But with the rise of the internet in the 1990s, all those companies were not able to come up with a second innovative idea, being isolated in the suburban office parks. And pretty much 100% of the Massachusetts Miracle companies, the Wangs, the Digitals, the Apollo computers, are all out of business today.
Oh, yeah.
And the companies in Massachusetts and people starting new companies starting in the 90s looked at what happened in Silicon Valley and the success of Silicon Valley with the rise of the internet. And one of the lessons that they drew from it was that this sort of notion of serendipitous interaction between people that you only get with density, where people from different companies meet in a coffee shop and it's just bad ideas around, was really seen as incredibly important to how innovation happens. And so as a result of that, companies saw the benefit of locating close to other companies. And that really led to the rise first of Kendall Square in East Cambridge, and then, the success of the Seaport and Longwood, where these companies want to cluster in urban places that are walkable or accessible by public transportation, the importance of being on the red line, say. And so I don't think I don't think we're going to reverse that. I have no fear that suddenly companies are the rise of the office park is going to happen again. So I don't think we're going back to 1970s Boston and the massive disinvestment. I do fear, though, that the lessons that we learned, there was such a negative reaction to urban renewal and the highway building that we learned how to say no to things for the first time in the 1960s and 1970s. And I think we learned that lesson too well, so that now we say no to everything and any kind of change. The change was so dramatic and traumatic for so many people that now the notion of any kind of change is terrifying. And I think it's one of the major reasons that we're not able to build the housing or do the investment in public transportation. The Big Dig actually was one of the greatest public investments ever in the history of the city, particularly because the federal government paid for half of it. I would do it again in a heartbeat. But people were traumatized by the Big Dig, and it's making similar major public investments extremely difficult to pull off. And so because of the negative response we get to investing in the city in any kind of major way in terms of housing and transportation, I do fear, as I mentioned before, that we're not going to remain competitive. So I'm quite optimistic we're not going back to the sort of massive disinvestment and fleeing from the city that we saw in the 70s and earlier. But I'm not optimistic that we're going to be able to do the necessary steps that's going to keep the greater Boston region truly being one of the special cities in the world. And I fear that a lot of the cities that we look down on today are catching up rapidly.
That's really interesting. And Larry, you were there in the 70s and lived through it. I know you've written about it yourself and your experiences. And it's interesting. It would seem hard to imagine. I guess history never repeats itself exactly, right? So a repeat of the 70s. On the other hand, you could have stagnation, comparative lost or relative
There
loss
are,
to other cities.
Scott, some comparisons.
Yep.
The federal government was in chaos in the 70s.
Mhm.
You can make the case it will be in chaos perhaps for the next 4 years. Uncertainty is usually a very bad thing for people who have money to invest, and they find other places to put it. Inflation in the 70s hit double digits in the middle of the decade, probably cost Jerry Ford the election. Nice man, I met him once. We have some inflation, but nothing like that.
Oh, yeah.
And unfortunately, in the 70s, we also had very high unemployment. There were years when it was 8, 9, 10%. And in Boston, most of the people who were out of work were younger people, most of them men. There's one thing a society doesn't really need, it's unemployed young men. That's why we've had mandatory military service, the Crusades, the CCC during the Depression. And all of that aided in the urban unrest. And then, of course, we had the arson rings in the 70s. I don't think we'll see that again. And 2 of those arson rings involved people who were in the fire department or the police department.
Oh my gosh.
Which is a scary thing.
That is.
In the Fenway, there was Symphony Road. Almost an entire street was burnt. Difficult to imagine that. Now it's, flourishing yuppie nation over there. And there was a group of people who would wait for a building to be abandoned and then go up and to the nearest hill and see it go on fire. They got a hoot out of it. The book's entitled Burn, Baby, Burn. I doubt we'll see that.
Burn Boston, burn, I think.
What'd you say?
Burn Boston, burn, I think is the book.
Yeah, maybe it's Burn Boston. Yeah. But it was it's a hardly well written, but it gives you all the details. And, you know, I think so there's a lot of parallels, but a lot of things are also very different because I think many people want to live in cities. You know, I'm a baby boomer. And the first thing most of our parents did was they got out of the city. My parents didn't. We stayed in Dorchester. And the kids I grew up with who grew up in Dorchester, first thing they did when they got married, they took the cash they had at the wedding, they put down a down payment in Plymouth or Braintree, one of those places. Now their kids wish they hadn't sold the two-decker on Common Hill Avenue because they want to live in the city. And younger people pay lots of money to live in the city. You know, I know the city street by street. There are streets in Dorchester which were rough and tumble when I was on the city council 50 years ago, where three-deckers as is, no improvements, are now being sold for $1 million or more. And there's only one thing that can be done with them. They have to be rehabbed and flipped, which means that the people who lived there before and people like them will never be able to live there again. So we're seeing that throughout the city, which probably is better than disinvestment and arson.
Sure. Yeah, that would, it's definitely would be disinvestment and arson, that's for sure. Justin, so I'm wondering, do you, how much do you get any business from downtown residents, or is it mainly professionals? And are you seeing any growth there at all in kind of the residential kind of neighborhood that does actually exist downtown and it has been growing slowly over the years? Or is it really more professionals coming in and yeah, what are you seeing?
It's a mix, but heavily biased towards people who work in the city. Of course, a lot of the people that work downtown also live downtown, and to Larry's point about in the past where people they hit a certain point in their lives and immediately moved out of the city. I'm seeing more people around retirement age decide to stay in the city or move to the city. Whether it's Back Bay or some of the residential around this neighborhood, or maybe over to the seaport. And we have maybe 10% of our clientele fits that demographic. So that's an interesting shift. I know for me, as a younger person being here, so I grew up in the suburbs. Like, I don't even know if you could call it a suburb. It was, way out Fitchburg, Leominster, Worcester County area, and
Exodus, right?
There you go. Right. So I guess for me, like, I've seen a huge amount of benefit to my life living in a city, in a city. And when I'm thinking about cities, I'm saying if more people could experience this kind of lifestyle, and it takes a little while, but I think a lot more people would be on board with it. Because my wife and I, we love it, and we're not going to leave.
That's good to hear. That's definitely good to hear. And that kind of brings me to my next subject, which is one effort of the mayor is to try to kind of bring, some new vitality or renewed vitality to downtown has been the conversion of office buildings to residential, and wondering, Dan, are you seeing that take off, or has it been limited? And if it's been limited, why? It seems like a great idea. You get all these empty office buildings. Why not just turn them into, there's a demand for housing. On the other hand, I've been hearing about it a lot, and it seems like it's been kind of a slow grind.
Bringing more people to live downtowns is sort of the holy grail of downtown urban policy. Generally you measure whether cities are being successful based on how much they're used by people. So, and that's a 24/7 question. So if cities are used only during the workday, then that's not there's not as much vitality as you would have if people are there at nights and weekends. And of course, then you have people on nights and weekends, meaning generally residents, then they're supporting restaurants, they're supporting different mixes of business. And then when restaurants are open and bars, and if retail stays open later, you have, bright lights on streetscapes. So now it feels safer. Crime tends to go down. So there's a whole bunch of business, a whole bunch of benefits to having mixed use neighborhoods. Certainly Jane Jacobs wrote about this really compellingly in The Death and Life of Great American Cities in 1961. So converting a neighborhood that's almost entirely office with just a teeny bit of residential and a little bit of hotel and retail to more mixed use and 24/7, is a fantastic policy idea. The trouble is, the challenge, and it's happening a little bit, but happening slowly and probably will always happen too slowly to make a major impact, is if you own an office building, it's a major investment to convert to residential. And so you can only make that investment if your building is empty. So if you have a 4-story Class B building with, one major tenant and that tenant moves out, well, now you have an empty building and maybe you have an opportunity. But if you have multiple tenants with leases that all expire across a 10-year period, if several tenants move out, if you had only 60% occupancy, that's a terrible occupancy, but it's still 60% of your building is producing revenue.
Sure.
And if that 60% have leases that spread out over, 6, 7, 8 years, you're not going to want to wait till all those leases expire to have an empty building without renewing them. And sometimes, if there's a really good opportunity, maybe you would pay a tenant to leave early, but that can be extremely expensive. So you sort of need the good luck to have a building be empty all at the same time, which doesn't happen all that often, particularly for taller buildings. And then on top of that, the way office buildings are set up doesn't lend itself to easy conversion to residential. So, for instance, bedrooms need to have windows. People don't like to have a lot of windowless space in a residence. So you tend to want to have very narrow floor plates for residential. Well, office, at least traditionally where you had file rooms and back office functions didn't need windows. And so offices, you tend to have much wider floor plates. And then further, the plumbing in offices tends to be in the middle of buildings. You have, a single, one men's room and one women's room located, in the core of the building. And so typically plumbing doesn't extend out to the perimeter. And so doing the conversion to bring plumbing so you can have bathrooms, spread throughout a building, particularly bathrooms with windows, to do the coring to do that in an existing building is extremely expensive. So there's some major structural challenges to doing conversion for landlords. So the city has been very supportive, and they're offering tax incentives, and I think it's John Weil at the city is leading the charge, and I think he's really, really good. And so I think the administration does have the right idea and is approaching it probably the right way to their credit, and see it as a potential benefit to the city. I just think the nature of the challenge is too great for it to make a major impact.
I think it's
Garner, what do you
a
think?
great idea in the abstract, but it's not abstract. It's hard buildings, it's elevators and plumbing, just like Dan said. One thing I've bounced off is a lot of the older high-rise buildings. I think of 99 High Street, which is down the street from us, which is a 50, 55, maybe 60-year-old building. I'm not so sure they have a lot of tenants in the lower elevator banks. You could make them into dormitories. And in which case you reduce your need for bathrooms, because dormitories have shared bathrooms. Sure. And you have the cafeteria and the gym. Maybe Justin can, have a subsidiary for the dorm. And I think young people probably would get a hoot out of living downtown. And the difficulty with our residential neighborhoods is that the housing that was occupied by my family and the people I grew up with is in many cases now occupied by young single people, many of whom are going to college or graduate school. And that's the affordable housing in the city. The 3-deckers and the 2-deckers, that's your affordable housing. Really great way to raise a family upstairs and down with family of different generations, like most of us were raised in the years after the war. And you want those people out of Mission Hill. You want them out of Dorchester. You want them in a place where they will only rely upon public transportation. And I think dorms downtown could make some sense and would give a 24-hour life to the city. Maybe not early in the morning because they don't necessarily get up early like we do. And I think that's an option. You can't make somebody do it. And by the way, it's not good for the tax base because residential pays less than office does. But that may be better than having an empty office building looking for an abatement every year.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's interesting, the idea of dormitory space or expansion. And of course, then you'd have the other issue, right? If they're because colleges are tax exempt, right? So then would they pay taxes on that? And but on the other hand, it is students, graduate students, undergrads put a huge amount of pressure on rents. I mean, the pandemic was like a huge experiment and, unplanned experiment of what would happen if you took all these students out of Boston. Well, rents went down. So you want to take some pressure off the housing stock. That could be a way to do it. And you have these empty buildings. But on the other hand, if you have office buildings pay a lot of taxes, right? And if you replace it with a dorm, what happens then, right? I mean, that's tough. Right?
Yes, that's not good for your tax base. But on the other hand, it probably will keep the retail, the coffee shops, the sandwich shops
Sure.
alive just because there's more business.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I mean, every college, university has an institutional master plan. And I think it's 10 years, they have to renew. And maybe the city should encourage them to do so. And Justin, you were talking about coming in from Fitchburg and Leominster, where I've campaigned going back to 1968. And I did a deal for Converse. You see the Converse sign as you come in on 93? That's my sign.
Oh
I
yeah.
negotiated that sign. Converse moved in from North Andover or someplace like that, 400 jobs, primarily because the workforce they wanted was younger people who didn't want to be out someplace without sewers, but rather be in the city. And they weren't the only ones.
Sure.
And
Cool.
it's generational. And there's a train that heads out to Leominster and Fitchburg. It does not go as far as Garner. Stops in Fitchburg, right?
That's right.
And it's a haul to come on in. And
is.
young people want to be able to get places and do things.
Right. Yeah, it's the purple line.
Yes, I lived in Gardner for 9 months and I moved to Quincy. So I was trying to do the commute when I was first starting off, and that was I did a lot of reading. I caught up on a lot of
The mayor of Gardner, Mike Nicholson, wonderful young man, 30 years old, one of my Boy State kids years ago. Nicholson commuted to Suffolk Law School 4 years from Gardner.
man.
And he lived to tell the story.
It's a haul.
That's
Yes,
incredible.
it's beautiful, beautiful country though out there. Public transportation. The other thing is, how much is our dysfunctional public transportation system playing a role in, people just not, maybe they have the option to come back and work in the office or another day of the week, but it's just like, I can't deal with this. The T breakdowns, or I'm going to get stuck in traffic. How much of that is just like killing the appetite for commuting that that downtown depends upon, right? What do you think, Dan?
Well, there's a lot of beating up on transportation, and I think it is a problem, and I think requires a major investment. I do remind people, though, that Boston is, in fact, one of the few American cities with a generally comprehensive public transportation system. You know, New York's is more comprehensive and more reliable. DC is okay, but there aren't too many cities that I want to trade our public transportation network for, particularly because while there's been great disinvestment in public transportation, and our transportation network is smaller than it used to be, we didn't go as far as some cities in the wholesale ripping out of train lines. We did rip out quite a few train lines. You can still see sort of ghost remnants of old trolley tracks in Boston, but not to the extent that others did. So I think we're lucky that we actually do have a rail system that does move people around, and as much as we complain, it is pretty remarkable of how many people it moves around the city every day in a relatively reliable way, not as reliable as we would like. But it is problematic because it's not as frequent as you know, say in New York, and there are certain inconveniences that because of slow trains and the like, and so, you know, and certainly I've seen post-COVID, for instance, I take the Needham line, which used to have trains every half an hour during rush hour, and now it's every hour. And I try to take the train as much as I can, but sometimes I have to drive. And I have to say the roads seem as busier than pre-COVID. And yet downtown is probably at sort of 60 to 65% its pre-COVID levels, which I think just in that tells you that a far higher percentage of people from the suburbs are driving than they did pre-COVID. And so we really need to make the investment. If people are going to be able to move around the region, if the roads aren't going to be completely clogged, and if we're going to be able to, you know, transportation policy is part and parcel to housing policy. So if we can get people from different areas efficiently into the city, that opens up entire aspects of the housing market, you know, serving as a real relief valve on housing prices. So I think we need a major investment, a major additional investment in our public transportation, both fixing it as well as expanding it. So this notion
Sam Bass Warner's book, Dan, Streetcar Suburb, which I read cover to cover. He was also one of my supporters when I ran for office. Talks about how the trolley lines were the impetus for residential development in the city.
Yeah.
And there were trolley lines. There was a trolley line that went straight down Blue Hill Avenue. And now the mayor is in a big brouhaha to get a bus lane. Guess what? They ripped it up. Grown up in the city, you could take the line from Kenmore out through Brighton Center, Oak Square, Newton Corner, Watertown.
Yep.
Pickering always talks about Watertown being the least transit accessible. It had a trolley line, and they ripped it up early 70s. I moved to JP. We had a trolley. Some people didn't like it. They ripped it up. And so people either crowd themselves into the 39 bus, or they take Ubers or they drive. And, you know, it's amazing to me that all of the impetus from all the bright young people out there who want everything to be electric, we had it all electric, and we ripped it up. We had trackless trolleys in Dorchester. We had them coming out of Harvard Square until very recently. We let them go. So it's like we're going backwards.
It is crazy. I mean, I think about that occasionally, that, you know, even every suburb had its own streetcar system. I think somebody wrote a book in like the 1890s where they traveled from Maine to like Washington just using like trolleys. I mean, you could do that. It was, and now.
Hope they packed a lunch.
Yeah.
But it's
I
also,
don't know
Larry,
how long it took. It might have taken them quite a while, but they did it. Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't just trains that were moving people around, you know, commuters around. It was also industrial trains, right? So you still see, if you go out to different places where there are businesses, you see old rail right of ways and some sort of ghost remnants of rail lines that used to service businesses to move products, and they ripped those up to replace them with trucks, and those trucks are getting on our streets. So, it hasn't been as bad as other cities. We didn't rip up as much as some cities did.
Sure.
But and a lot of that, particularly in other cities, were funded by the auto industry. But Boston, like other cities, came by the 1950s to embrace an auto-centric suburban lifestyle. And so, disinvesting in public transportation was seen as part of that. And people were moving out of the city. And so we need to be more efficient to move people around the city, to keep them in the city. And as I mentioned, it's part of housing policy as well.
So we're getting close to our time here, but I'll throw one last thing out. And it's a little more amorphous, I think, but I do hear, complaints maybe from the residential side. They're concerned about, growing concerns about public safety, about crime. Of course, you have the city saying, look, everything's great. This, crime is down, but you have people on the residential side saying, look, well, it's more of a quality of life, yeah, addiction, other kind of problems that have spilled over. And I'm wondering whether any of you seeing that, or wondering whether that's a concern that the city maybe should put more resources into, or rethink how they're dealing with some of these issues.
And compared to the 70s, we are an extraordinarily safe place. In the 70s, much of the violence was random violence. Most of the violence we see today is people who know each other. It's a drug deal gone bad.
Sure.
That man just killed his wife, 3 babies. Her name was Chantel, was in the papers. That doesn't explain or justify it, but it's a different kind of fear than we had in the 70s, when people really did not feel safe because they probably weren't.
Sure.
And that's aside from the school-related violence in the middle of that decade. So I think the mayor's stats are quite good. I think we compared to most of the other major cities. I mean, Chicago has 800-900 murders, some crazy thing like that.
Sure.
Atlanta, those places, 400, 500, 600. So I mean, but I think that when crime is random, that's when people really are worried. I don't sense that as much as I did decades ago.
That's interesting. Dan or Justin, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it is an issue to some extent, at least from my observation and from the folks that I know that live down here, you in the downtown Crossing area. Larry, like you said, it seems to be mostly targeted, and there's some eyesore type things going on with the homeless and drug addiction. I think it's important to keep in mind, both in the transportation issue and things like crime, is that anything that happens today is projected and amplified through the internet and social media, and it tends to have an outsized effect on how people experience the world.
Sure.
And sort of back onto the public transportation point, is that during the pandemic, I think people really got comfortable and or used to being alone a lot. They got scared of interacting with other people because of disease. And then it's sort of like, now we're at this point where we want and need to move forward, but we're going to have to do an even better job on something like public transportation. Like, it really has to be great and easy for people to use it. Otherwise, they just won't, because either they don't have to or they don't want to. Do you know what I'm saying? And when I think about crime, it's sort of the same thing. It's going to have to be that much better in order to have an actual effect on people's perception of the area.
Yeah, I mean, a little bit, unfortunately, goes a long way, potentially in shaping public opinion. And Dan, any thoughts or any last thoughts on any of these issues as we wrap up here?
I I mean, I could talk about crime policy for a while. I do notice that Jen has posted some questions from the audience, some of which
Oh,
look.
yeah.
So I don't know if you want to, since we do
Sure.
have 5 more minutes at least, do you want to pick
Yeah, of
out
course.
2 or 3
Yeah.
questions that seem good, and maybe
That sounds
we'll.
great. So, Jen, do you have those or?
Yeah, Jen, do you want to just pick a couple to ask us?
Sure. So somebody is asking about the bike lane, the additions of the bike lanes. Has that added too much congestion, and has that become counterproductive?
I think in certain neighborhoods it has. I think it's brought chaos to the Back Bay, and people in West Roxbury don't like them either.
There's a terrific book. Get the guy's first name. His last name is Vanderbilt. The book's called Traffic, and it argues counterintuitively that it's actually safer to have fewer lines and rules than more, and that when pedestrians and bikes and cars all need to share the same space, the study is mostly based in Europe. People learn how to respect other people in the space, and they drive more slowly. And by driving more slowly, also counterintuitively, you actually move through the area quicker. And that often it becomes less safe when you have more rules and more lines that get complicated and give you this false sense of security to go faster. On the other hand, people I know who bike think that the bike lanes are a good safety feature. So, it's hard to say. I think we do want to encourage people to seek alternative forms of transportation that are not driving, and so biking should be part of that solution. And I agree with Larry that sometimes it feels sort of chaotic with all these bike lanes that are in all these sort of unexpected places, and then you add bus lanes in, and then the car lanes are just one lane, and they get easily backed up, particularly when you add in double parked Uber and and DoorDash or whatever. So transportation policy is a really, really tricky one, but sometimes the solutions are counterintuitive.
Sure. And is there any thoughts on whether or not it would make sense to, instead of residential, have some of these spaces converted to lab space and research space? Since I know there's a lot of new buildings going on, is there any potential downtown?
Well, I mean, that was the big rush 2 years ago, is that office landlords were converting as fast as they could to lab, and in fact were paying really, really big bounties to move office tenants out so they could do lab conversions. The problem is just, the supply went up very rapidly for a few years, and the amount of international venture capital money going into life science companies in Boston is, still at historically very, very high levels. I think we're sort of similar to where we were in about 2018, but we're about half where we were 2 or 3 years ago. And these life science companies that are moving into these spaces tend to be pre-revenue companies. So they're, in order to hire people and to pay their rent, they're dependent on accessing venture capital, because they can't pay their rent through revenue. And so as the venture capital has fallen off, the number of companies with money to hire employees and to pay rent is significantly lower than it was just 2 or 3 years ago. So we have a massive oversupply compared to demand right now. And so I don't think you're going to see any investment in new lab space in Boston other than sort of Class A build-to-suits for the biggest companies in at least 10 years.
Wow.
And I expect that the uncertainty about National Institutes of Health and other federal investments in research will also have a chilling effect. And once you have a lab building and you put in north of $1,000 a foot with all the pipes and the wires and all the ventilation systems, you can't make it into housing or anything else.
Right.
Sure.
Yep.
Well, other questions will be addressed again tomorrow during a live that Scott is going to be putting together. So if you have more questions, please join that.
Yeah, I want to thank you all for being here today. This was a great discussion, and for taking the time here. And we'll be posting the video on YouTube, and I'll be writing a story about, looking at some of what we wrote about and talked about, and writing a story based on that as well. So you can read it in Contrarian Boston. And so again, thank you again for all taking the time here today, and great discussion. I really appreciated all the insights, and perspectives here. All right.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
See you
you.
next
Scott.
Thursday, Dave.
Thanks, Jen,
Yep.
Larry, Justin.
Thank you.
Well,
Nice to meet you all.
Well, nice to see you.